Hello, and welcome to Keep the Channel Open, a podcast featuring conversations about art, literature, and creativity. My name is Mike Sakasagawa, and this is episode 130. Today's guest is Sarah Hollowell. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the show. My guest on this week's episode is Sarah Hollowell. Sarah Hollowell is a fat, queer Hoosier writer aiming to up the magic quotient of Indiana. Her debut YA contemporary fantasy novel, the Locus Award-nominated A Dark and Starless Forest, is available now. Her second book, What Stalks Among Us, is coming in 2023. Her work has appeared on the No Sleep podcast, Fireside Fiction, Huffington Post, and in The Other F Word, a celebration of the fat and the fierce. She volunteers with teen writers through the Alpha Workshop and raises small cryptids in the shape of cats. She can be found on Twitter at Sarah Hollowell or at sarahhollowell.com. So, I've been a fan of Sarah's writing for quite some time now. Some of you may have heard her short story Crow's Eye on my other podcast, Likewise Fiction. If you haven't, well, it was featured in the second episode, and I highly recommend it. It's a great example of what Sarah does so well in fiction. Things like creating an atmosphere of both wonder and danger, portraying family relationships, especially sisterhood. And so when I heard that she was going to be publishing a novel, I pre-ordered it right away, and I'm glad I did. A Dark and Starless Forest was exactly what I hoped it would be, taking many of the elements I'd loved in her stories and expanding them into a perfectly paced and wonderfully satisfying YA novel. Obviously, I was pleased to get the opportunity to talk with her for today's episode. As always, if you'd like to purchase a copy of A Dark and Starless Forest, my first recommendation is to order it from your local independent bookstore. But if you haven't got one of those, there are links in the show notes to order it from bookstores that Sarah and I selected in her area and mine, as well as from bookshop.org. All right, let's get started. Here's my conversation with Sarah Hollowell. I believe I've told you this already, but I really enjoyed reading your book. I really enjoyed A Dark and Starless Forest. And one of the things that I was thinking about when I started reading this book, or really when I first heard that you were going to have a book out, is like, what is a Sarah Hollowell novel going to be like? Because I'd read several of your short stories at that point. Of course, I had featured one of your short stories on Likewise Fiction, a story that I deeply loved. And what I thought was interesting about the experience of reading this debut novel of yours is that it really feels like a Sarah Hollowell story, just in the same vein as all of the short stories do. I feel like I noticed a lot of similar sort of themes and motifs coming up in the novel as from the short stories, things like, spooky forests and sisterhood, a fat protagonist, maybe a focus on family. Things like that are sort of running through a lot of your stories, I feel like. But I wanted to start here with this sort of difference between the short stories and the novel, or if you feel like the writing process was particularly different between the two.
The writing process is different, obviously, just in terms of how long it takes. Because with my short stories, I haven't written a lot of short stories recently, but I used to write quite a few of them. And my process with those was pretty much always that I would write everything in my head, and those scenes would be really disconnected, and then I would go back and start filling them in. Whereas with my books, I have found that I really do need to outline. I want to be a pantser a little bit just because that's more like natural to me in some ways, but outlining helps so much. There's a lot more outlining. There's a lot more planning, although not as much planning as some writers do. I'm not someone who makes really elaborate character profiles or anything like that, but just more planning than I do with a short story, which is usually none. A lot more showing up in my friends' DMs to say, does this make sense? Is this anything? I'm writing a garbage book. And also kind of a need for constant validation in some ways. With short stories, I don't show them to anyone until they're done, or if I get to a point where I'm just really stuck and I just need someone to tell me what to do next. With my books, so far anyway, I haven't actually finished that many books. It's 2, 3, if you count the one from high school. But the process that works for me is that when I start it, once I've gotten a chapter or two, like a pretty solid base, and I know also that this is a book I am finishing, either because my agent and I both like it or because it has been, bought and I'm contractually obligated to finish it. I invite usually 3 friends, the same friends, into the Google Doc for it. It's usually my friends Jackson and Brittany, and then Sarah Daly. Mm-hmm. And they are my cheerleaders.
That's a great phrase.
Isn't it? I love it. And it's something in the beginning, this is what I desperately need. Like, I just need people to tell me what they like. If they see me doing something that's like really like bad, if they're like, actually the direction you're going is really problematic, then I want them to tell me that. But I don't want them to tell me this character arc feels like slow or this plot point doesn't make sense. I don't want those things yet, because that will just completely throw me off. I won't want to work on it anymore because I'll be so distracted by that. Mm-hmm. So in the beginning, I just need them to tell me what's good. And I tell them, I've got a few more chapters. And they're always really good about reading it. Whereas obviously with short stories, I just wait until the end before I throw it at usually those same people. And then also just with books, I feel like it's with the books I've written, there's been a slight more sense of just knowing people are going to read it. Like with a short story, it kind of feels more like maybe someone will. Cool. And with the book, there's also that sense, but at the same time, I know someone will, and that's really weird and really scary. And it's hard to get that out of my head when I'm writing sometimes. Yeah. I have to an extent, but it's just hard not to think, what is a stranger going to think when they read this? Or it was so weird when A Dark and Starless Forest even just was going out in review copies, thinking there are people reading this other than my friends and my mom and my publishing team. That was wild. Yeah. And it was even harder to forget writing my second book, because I had by that point been getting I didn't really start working on it in earnest until after A Dark and Starless Forest came out. So I already was getting reactions and things to that. Although that has been pretty much overwhelmingly positive. I'm sure there are people who have read it and didn't like it, but I have not seen those reviews because I do not look at any reviews, and I have been lucky enough to so far only be tagged in one bad review.
I don't know why people feel the need to do that. It's so disrespectful.
It's really, really weird. I just muted them because I was like, I don't know why you're doing this, and I don't really want to reward you for it either. Yeah. But for the most part, it's been really, really positive. But in some ways, that also still makes me feel pressure with the second book, because then I'm like, but what if they don't like this one? Yeah, yeah.
Do you find with the longer form, because, one of the things that I think, and I think this is true of not just all writers or most writers, but most artists really in any medium, sort of tend to have a set of issues or things that they like to think about that they often revisit over and over again in their work. And when you're talking about short stories, it can be kind of easier to see that those same sort of problems that you can't get out of your head coming back over and over again, just because, like you said, they're shorter and they tend to come out more often. It's easier to write a lot of them in a short period of time. But one thing that I sort of think about here is that the novel form being longer, both longer in terms of the number of pages, but also longer in terms of how you, the author, are engaged with that work, creating that work for a longer period of time. Do you feel like it allows you to explore those concerns in a different way from the way that the short story does?
Yeah, absolutely. I think one thing that I really enjoy about tackling that kind of stuff in a novel is having the room to explore nuance that I don't have the room to do in a short story. People who are just better at short stories than me can get some amazing nuance into their short stories. I think I write pretty good short stories. I like my short stories, but there are definitely people who are better at it. I like having kind of room to breathe a little more. I feel like my ideal length is actually closer to like a novella, but the thing I immediately thought of when you were talking about that was something that comes up in obviously Dark and Starless Forest, and that is also a huge part of my second book, What Stalks Among Us, is abuse dynamics.
Mm-hmm.
And something I very purposefully wanted to explore in A Dark and Starless Forest, and then which kind of just popped up in What Stalks Among Us. I thought I was just writing a creepy corn maze book, and then it was like, nope, this one's about abuse too. But one of the things I really wanted to tackle, and that I feel like I had the room to work with in A Dark and Starless Forest, was the complexities of how you feel about someone who is abusing you. How it's not just a simple sort of, they're abusing me, this is bad, I hate them.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes it is, it kind of depends. Obviously every dynamic and relationship is different, but I know the times that I've experienced it has not been that simple. And there has still been a sense of loving that person, or wanting them to be proud of me, or wanting to make them happy, sometimes out of a survival thing, because like the happier you make them, sometimes that means they're nicer to you. And sometimes you also just genuinely want to make them happy. And then other times you're really angry, like you're just really, really mad that they're treating you this way. And then you're really depressed, and then you blame yourself and you blame them. It's just really complicated. I don't think there's really a lot of simple emotions when it comes to being a victim of abuse. And I really wanted to explore that in A Dark and Starless Forest. And I think for the most part, I was pretty successful. The thing that kind of tells me that in some ways I have been is one of my favorite reactions to track from readers is how quickly they distrust Frank. Because there are people who, from literally his first appearance on like the first page, have told me that they hated him. Immediately they didn't trust him. Immediately they were like, this guy's bad. And then there were other people who kind of went for what I was purposefully trying to do, which was making them kind of wonder for a little bit, like making them go, this doesn't seem good, but then in other ways he takes care of them, like he nurtures them, he's pretty nice, so I don't really know which one he is, but everyone eventually gets to the place where they hate him. But it's sort of thing where it's like those were kind of reactions I hoped for / predicted, for the people who either took a while to figure him out, or the people I kind of had a thought that people who have experienced this very specific type of emotional manipulation and abuse would clock him instantly. Like I kind of thought that would happen, but I wasn't sure. And it turns out, yes.
Yeah.
Or just people who are naturally distrustful, an adult man who is controlling a group of mostly teenage girls, understandably not totally sure about him.
Yeah. It was something that I found really interesting about the experience of reading the book, because I don't know if I necessarily clocked at the very beginning from like the first time you meet Frank, but there was sort of a sense of foreboding about all of his interactions from very early on in the story for me. And I think it's compounded by the fact that the ways that each of the girls interacts with him is sort of different, which I think really gets to what you're talking about abuse dynamics being complicated. Since you see things so closely from Derry's perspective, you get so much of what she's thinking and feeling, and her feelings about him in the beginning of the book and really running through a lot of the book are complicated. I think that especially for someone who hasn't experienced that dynamic, it probably would be easier to miss early on. But I think that was something that I really appreciated about the book. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I mean, that's something I was definitely trying to pull off with it was that thing of, if you have seen it, either experienced it yourself or just seen someone else do it or just learned about it, then you'll probably notice it. If you haven't, then it's going to creep up on you a little more. Because I feel like that's also kind of mimicking in some ways the experience of some emotionally abusive relationships or abusive relationships in general, where they usually don't start bad.
Right.
It's usually kind of a gradual and then very sudden thing. And to your point about the different characters reacting to him differently, that's also something I really enjoyed exploring. And there's one character that no one ever talks to me about, and I am like thirsty to know what people think of her, because she is very precious to me and she's a very difficult character. But I love Elle with all my heart. And one of the things I really love about her and loved about writing her is that her reaction to Frank is basically the polar opposite almost of Derry's, because like Derry has this desire she wants Frank to be proud of her and she wants to keep him happy, but she also is like battling all these other feelings and not sure, and she's angry. Whereas like her survival instinct with Frank is 100% to be his favorite, 100% to go above and beyond being the best kid, the best, the best magic user, the best everything, and like making sure that she is his favorite. And how that can even sometimes manifest as her like kind of like throwing her siblings under the bus a little bit with him. Not all of them, but like just occasionally, especially with Derry. Derry and Elle have an interesting relationship to me.
Yeah.
But Elle she just makes me so like happy and sad in terms of like, I really like her dynamic with Derry. And to me, it was important to kind of show this other side of an abuse victim where they don't necessarily act in super sympathetic ways.
Mm-hmm.
It's not super sympathetic that she is kind of like, she acts sometimes more like she's on Frank's side than she is on anyone else's. And that's a survival instinct. But from the outside, it just looks like she's being like mean. It just looks like she's being kind of like shitty or like just weirdly holier than thou, when I don't think that's really what she's like. It just has to do with how she is surviving Frank. And if I ever got to like do that thing where people sometimes write like novellas or short stories from the point of view of another character, it would probably be Elle. I would really love to write something from Elle's point of view of how the events of A Dark and Starless Forest went for her, and like the ways she feels about her siblings, her different siblings, and obviously like her protectiveness over them, but also the things she's willing to sacrifice.
Yeah. It's interesting that you would sort of characterize her as, doing things that are kind of shitty, which I can see. But the thing that came across to me about the character of Elle is, over and over again, I just kept thinking to myself, she must just be terrified all the time.
Yes.
And what's interesting to me about that dynamic too is the abuse dynamic is really central to, I think, the characterization of all of the relationships in the book, not just between Frank and each of the sisters, but also between the sisters, right? Really, a lot of that is informed by the abuse dynamic as well. But I think another thing that I was thinking about is how you actually see that kind of behavior just in general, I feel like, between girls and boys, girls and men, men and women. You know what I mean? Like where the sort of overarching terribleness of the patriarchy forces people to respond to it in different ways, where some people respond very much by pushing against it and trying to fight it, where other people respond by trying to become a part of it. You know what I mean?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah. And I thought that was a really interesting way that played out in this sort of created family, if that makes sense.
No, it totally does, because that's something I was kind of going for. Also, I love that like you saw Elle as being terrified, because that is what she is to me. And I guess it's kind of almost more my anxiety that people would see her as being shitty. But I haven't actually heard people don't really talk to me about a lot of the characters other than Derry and Winnie. A lot of fan love for Winnie has come my way, which is deserved and correct, because she's wonderful. They all are, though, is the problem in my mind. But yeah, like, I think that happens across so many different situations where people are either being like hurt or marginalized or anything like that, where they're the people who, it's that fight or flight sort of thing, except it's like fight, flight, hide, and like assimilate. That's why you get women who say, you know, oh, that joke isn't sexist, you're just sensitive, or, you know, just try to defend anything a shitty guy does. Because same with, you'll see fat people doing that against fat phobic comments. They'll say, well, I am fat and I think it's funny, or I'm fat but at least I know that's bad. And it's them trying to not be a target. It's them trying to make someone else the target, basically. And it is totally a survival thing. And I think it's really complicated. It's super, super complicated, because that can cause real harm and be genuinely very bad. But then you also understand the motivation, and they are also still going to be victims of oppression, because when it comes down to it, the people who would hate any fat person is still going to hate the one who is siding with them. But yeah, I kind of tried to work with that with the siblings as well, and kind of trying to think of like, what would their responses be, while also still trying to kind of work with the fact that they're all kids. And I don't know. I mean,
I think that does really, I think it puts the reader in the space to be more understanding and forgiving of things like that. You know, like, for example, I mean, I don't have any experience, obviously, being on the receiving end of, you know, what women deal with in a patriarchal society. But, you know, as a non-white person, you know, when I was a kid, I grew up in a town that was very white, and I was one of, you know, just a very few people in my school system that wasn't a white person. And, you know, like, there is a way that when I look at my younger self and I look at how much I was trying to be like the Asian guy who was like cool with it, you know, like who would just, you know, like, please just, you know, be my friend kind of thing, because I'll laugh at the same jokes, you know, or, you know, even the way that like some of my cousins and I would, you know, make jokes about people who sounded like they were fresh off the boat, you know. And that's something that I think, if I were to look back on myself with less empathy, then I would be really like angry about that, or maybe ashamed. But the fact that I was a literal child when I was doing that, you know, I think it sort of makes it more, you can have more compassion for that, you know? And I think that works here as well.
I mean, children in general already just learning to navigate the world, just in general. And even from the like a privileged status, that can still be so difficult, just like understanding what other humans are. But then when you add on layers of learning to navigate it as a woman, or as a non-white person, or as anything, it gets so complicated, and kids are still figuring out their own emotions and their own identities. And you kind of start to just do the thing that seems to make the people around you happy. That is like, I mean, not everyone does, obviously, but I'm a people pleaser. So that's what I immediately think of. Like, yeah, no, I definitely, when I think about some of the ways I reacted to things like misogyny or like fat phobia when I was a kid, when I was a teenager, especially, when I was kind of starting to learn about those things, but was also still kind of being not like other girls. It's both a little embarrassing, but I can look back on it with some real compassion, because it's like, you don't really get it yet. Like, you have experienced this, but it's almost like what I think my experience was that I could not fully understand what it was doing to me yet. I couldn't really understand what the hurt actually was.
Yeah.
I could feel hurt, but I did not understand what it was going to do to me long term.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because as a kid, you're so in the moment a lot of the times, I think.
Yeah. Yeah. And you don't have the life experience to really be able to see yourself from outside of yourself, and see how all those things fit together. I wanted to switch gears a little bit, and I wanted to talk a little bit about fan fiction.
Hell yeah.
So, I had a feeling that you might respond that way. Because this is something that you've talked about on Twitter before, and I know that you've talked about this in other interviews about, fan fiction being something that was a big part of your coming into, being a fiction reader and perhaps a fiction writer as well. And there's something that I find really fascinating about the phenomenon of fan fiction, especially when, another thing that's very clear in this book and that you've talked about in other interviews is this idea of representation. And I know that fat representation is important to you and queer representation is important to you. You've talked about, why it was important to you to specifically name people's races in the characters. And what I find really interesting is that in YA fiction, well, maybe especially YA fiction, but really in fiction in general, I think a lot of these things about representation, the conversations have changed quite a lot in recent years, in maybe the past 10 or 15 years. But I guess I wonder how much of that is really informed by the experience of people being fan writers first. Does that question make sense?
It does. That's really interesting. I feel like it probably, I feel like those definitely can be related. I was like an avid fan fiction reader from the time I was like 12 up until high school, college-ish. I kind of fell off, not because I didn't like it anymore, but just because it was getting harder for me to sit and like read stuff off the computer. And also I was always really picky about like what kind of fan fiction I really liked and what fandoms I liked to read from. And I have no explanations for which ones I liked. Like I can't explain why I didn't like some and liked others. But fan fiction was, I know for one thing, extremely integral to me even realizing I was queer, because that's how I learned that bisexuality existed. That's how I heard the word for the first time and heard the concept was through probably Harry Potter fan fiction, if I'm honest. That was my main fandom, which also makes going back to fan fiction weird in some ways, because I'm not sure I would go back to Harry Potter fan fiction at this point.
Well, it's like we were saying, you get older and you learn things.
Yeah. But because I'm definitely one of those people who like Harry Potter was my personality for a long time and have had to kind of make a break from that. But Harry Potter fan fiction was part of what made me figure out that bisexuality was an option and that I could be that. And then, like you did kind of see more representation through that, either through people inserting original characters or just changing the existing characters to have traits that they wished they could see in media or in these books. And I do feel like that can definitely inform what they end up writing later. And I feel like it like I didn't write a lot of fan fiction. I wrote some, but I didn't write that much. I was always very nervous. I was always very nervous about getting things wrong, which is really weird. In hindsight, it's like a very silly thing to be worried about in fan fiction, but I didn't want to find out that I had forgotten some like detail from the books or from movies or whatever, and that I had contradicted it in fan fiction, even though fan fiction is constantly changing things and making things up. It was my own personal anxiety. I was not good at writing in other people's creations, but I wrote a little bit, and I feel like that attitude does still affect my writing, mostly in terms of wanting to feel free to write the things that I want to write and the things that make me happy. Like there was definitely a period during my fan fiction days where I was very like virulently anti like self-insert or Mary Sue or whatever. And now I'm the opposite. I'm like, Self-insert is great, actually. Especially for people who are in any way marginalized. Like sometimes that is the way that you see yourself in a book, is you write yourself into a book. And I think Mary Sue's are almost always just a misogynistic sort of perception of a totally normal female character. But that's the whole thing. I got a lot of people on Twitter yelling at me about Rey from Star Wars when I tweeted about that. So
Yeah.
I didn't even mention her. They just wanted to tell me that she was a Mary Sue. I still reject that premise entirely.
Yeah, and rightly so. I think, just fan fiction in general, people like to shit on it. And I don't think that you can separate out the gendered aspect of that, considering, that in, like, broadly speaking, a lot more fan fiction writers are women and girls than men or boys. And I think that, our whole history of, artistic anything is rife with people just deciding that because teenage girls like something, that means it's bad or cringe or whatever phrase you want to have at that particular moment in history. Even something like the Beatles, while they were still something that teenage girls were associated with, that was like, no, the Beatles why would anybody take them seriously? They're only for teenage girls. And what I find really interesting about how I think fan fiction and its interaction with sort of more traditional publishing, especially in YA, has changed over the years. I feel like there is, obviously there's a long way to go on things like that, but I feel like maybe we are reaching a point where the interests of girls or the interests of people of color or things like that they're not looked down on in the same way that they used to be. If we can, they still get a lot of pushback, obviously, like what you were saying, but like, I feel like the conversation may have shifted. What do you think about that?
I think it definitely has. I think there's definitely obviously a lot of pushback, and I think you'll especially just see, like, to me, it's not that the pushback doesn't exist. It's that there's the communities that embrace it are so much bigger than they used to be, and so much louder and more public. Like, it used to be that it was very much relegated to like the internet and fanzines, and the internet before the internet was in everyone's hand. Like, you had to go find the fan sites and learn about them and go through like those web rings and stuff that I never really understood. But I feel like, especially when there was just less of it, there was still like, I don't know, it's almost like a weird protectiveness and kind of in some ways going back to that idea of like, it's not quite fear because I don't think it's like the same thing, but just like not wanting to be made fun of. So you kind of like put other people under the bus. And I think it was happening more in all fandoms, where there would be fandoms that would then get shoved under the bus. And a lot of those were the ones with teenage girls. Yeah. And I think that's happening less, in part because I think I am just coming up with this theory literally as I'm talking, but I do wonder how much of it is because the teenage girls who were thrown under that bus are adults now, and they're feeling fiercely protective of trying to not let that happen to other teenage girls. Because I think that's kind of what I feel. Like, if there's something I don't really get, and I think it's like mainly a teenage girl thing, I don't go for it must be bad. I just kind of go for I'm old and just move on. Like, this doesn't even feel accurate in terms of like a teenage girl thing, because obviously the fan base for it is huge and widely varied. I have never fully understood the K-pop fandom or the fandom for a lot of just like pop things in general. I like pop music. I get that part. But even when I was a teenage girl myself, I was never really like rabid pop fan. And I think the K-pop fandom is where you see that at its largest right now. But I also don't think that's bad. I'm just kind of like, I am old and perhaps not the audience, but I want you guys to have fun.
Yeah.
I mean, since the K-pop fandom is also so large, that also means that you see a lot more examples of the toxicity that is in any community, obviously, that is much more prominent because that is such a huge population of people. I think you see that a lot more.
Mm-hmm. I
have blocked a lot of people with K-pop star avatars on Twitter. Or frankly, anytime I see someone where their avatar is like Ariana Grande or like Katy Perry, I kind of have a thought of, oh, you're not going to be fun to talk to.
Yeah, or the old school one was the anime avatars, right?
Still is. Well, I still don't trust. I don't trust an anime avatar, and I don't trust an avatar of like a photo of a statue of an old philosopher.
That's fair.
Those guys don't think women are people. It's so weird that there genuinely are some avatar themes where I'm like, I already know.
Yeah.
Anyway, I kind of like got off track, but I think that those things are able to blossom more, I guess. And it's kind of weird because they both are able to blossom more and get more pushback and then blossom again because of that eternal cycle of internet discourse of like, this thing is bad. And then, no, you just don't get why people like it and you're bad. And then, no, you just don't get why people don't like it and you're bad. And like, you see that with fandoms a lot. Like I'm thinking right now of Twilight, which obviously was, I think it can both be true that Twilight does not do good with things like native representation or race in general. And it can also be true that most of the reason that a lot of people hated it was because they knew teenage girls liked it.
Right.
Like, I think those things can exist together.
Yes.
But people act like only one can be true.
Yes.
Like, like, oh, Twilight is bad because it has really like bad representation or because of the relationship between Bella and Edward. And it has nothing to do with teenage girls. But then it's like, no, it's both.
Yeah.
Because I promise you, all of the people making those like memes of like Hermione and Bella, or not Hermione and Bella, Hermione and Buffy, about how they didn't need a guy to save the world, or like there's like some phrase that they used on those all the time that was very clearly targeted at just being like, these are real heroines, not Bella. Those people were not thinking about the native representation in Twilight.
Right.
That should be talked about. That is an extremely valid criticism of those books. But it is weird when I see people like acting like that means that misogyny was not part of it too. And it's like, no, they're both true. And I think that's true for a lot of things.
Yeah.
Yeah. But then again, I also I do still see pushback because I think about the reaction to Turning Red was so weird.
I mean, the reaction to basically every movie that has come out in the past few years that didn't center white people, especially white men or boys, has been very weird. I mean, whether it was Turning Red or Encanto or most recently Everything Everywhere All at Once.
I need to see that. I haven't gotten a chance yet, and I'm so mad because I swear to God, every day I see someone on social media like, I thought everyone was overhyping it, but that actually is the best movie I've ever seen.
It's pretty good.
I mean, I already wanted to see it from the trailer just because I was like, that looks good. But yeah, no, like, it's so weird. And I think Turning Red had such a pile of different things because there was obviously just the reaction that it was like, this is about an Asian girl. We hate that. This is about an Asian girl who likes boy bands, and she's like a very happy, loud fan of these things, and her friends are fans. Like, they're all fangirls. Like, just those things piling up made people so weird.
Yeah.
Because I know the first time I ever actually heard about it was when I saw someone posting a screenshot from the trailer of all the girls kind of like doing a silly pose together on the street and just saying like, teenagers don't really act this way. This is like, they're so over the top, and this is not actually how teenagers act. And it was such a weird denial of reality. It was like, I'm sorry, kids are weird as hell. Like, maybe you wouldn't have behaved that way as a kid, because some people are just naturally more embarrassed or socially awkward and don't want to make a scene. Like, that's totally true. I have at many times been that person. I have also at many times been that person when I was in like middle school and high school, especially, where like I kind of liked to just walk down the street with like 3 books on my head, balancing them on my head, just to prove I could. And that was probably weird to see, but I did it anyway. And I was, like I'm still a very loud fan of many things, but it was just so weird to see people suddenly acting like being a fangirl was unrealistic.
Yeah.
It's like, no, you're racist and sexist and who knows what else.
There's plenty to pick from.
Because frankly, that movie was like the most realistic depiction of being like 13 that I have ever seen in my life. Yeah. It was painful to watch, not because it was unrealistic or cringy, but just because it was so real.
Yeah. Yeah, it's the cringe that comes from remembering, not the cringe that comes from not being able to relate.
Exactly. But then again, I also think the very existence of Turning Red kind of shows an ability for fangirls and girl things to have a larger stage, that it was made, that someone got to tell basically like a love story to preteen tween fangirls is really cool.
Yeah.
And that it was so just like earnest. I never felt like that movie was making fun of them, which is the usual thing. There's movies I love where I still feel like they like made fun of that sort of fanish behavior. The first thing I thought of is, I don't even know, I have no perception of if this is an obscure reference because I've seen it so many times. The Josie and the Pussycats movie from like 2003, something like that, with
Tara Reid's in that, I think.
Tara Reid plays Melody, and Rosario Dawson, and Rachel Lee Cook. I wanted to say Evan Rachel Wood. That's a different person. Rachel Lee Cook is Josie, and one of the recurring jokes is this group of girls who are like very screamy fangirl people who are really mean to Josie and the Pussycats before they make it big. And then once they make it big, they show up at their door like screaming and wearing all their merch and just like, but it's making fun of them. Like, it's definitely not intended to be a fans are good thing. I love that movie, but that is one thing that is, I think, kind of more indicative of how fangirls were treated and still are treated in a lot of media.
Yeah.
But then you have Turning Red, where it's like, they saved the day. They saved the day by knowing the lyrics to this song. That's so beautiful. I cried.
Yeah.
I cry at everything, but I did cry.
Yeah. Turning Red is actually an interesting segue because I wanted to sort of switch gears a little bit and talk a little bit about anger. And
yes,
because, that obviously plays in that movie as well. So there might be some light spoilers or maybe some slightly less light spoilers, but I wanted to talk a little bit about the end of the book, because I think the way that Derry engages with anger and with violence and the desire for power, obviously these are things that are, in our culture very traditionally taught to women and girls as things to suppress. And there's something about the way that this happens in this book, especially in the climactic scene, where it is this very interesting combination of triumphant and kind of horrifying. And I feel like the way that the denouement and ending of this book plays out encapsulates both of those reactions. I wanted to talk to you a little bit about that, because I don't know how, if that reading feels right to you, you know what I mean?
Yeah, no, I think that totally makes sense, because I think that's kind of where I was writing it from. Like, I really wanted to write Derry as someone who is angry and does feel these kind of like violent urges and stuff, but also like kind of has to suppress them, but also eventually gets to release them. in part as like a catharsis for me as a person, because I'm someone who suppresses my emotions a lot, and very rarely lets myself just be angry at people, which is not great, honestly. And so I kind of wanted to write someone who could do that. And then also just, I'm totally one of those people where when I'm reading a book and someone is treating a character really, really unfairly, like what I want them to do is just yell at them. Like I want them to just like get in their face, and they barely do. And so I kind of wanted to write that, and also I wanted that catharsis for them in terms of knowing they are safe from Frank, because spoiler, he is dead. And at the same time, I also didn't want to act like it meant nothing for her to kill someone on purpose. It's kind of a weird, the characters I write in Derry especially is such a weird kind of contradiction for me, because in a lot of ways I really like to write really soft characters, really soft and kind characters. And I think Derry is that. She's just also really mad and she's really angry and obviously has a capacity for violence. And like, I wanted to be able to both explore how her killing Frank is not bad, but her taking a life is still going to mean something.
Right.
Because I kind of generally reject the idea that it's like, you can never retaliate against like your abusers violently or anything. I'm definitely like a punch Nazis sort of person and think there are cases where like violence is warranted, maybe necessary, maybe not necessary. I tend to prefer more pacifist, like nonviolent means where it's possible. But I think there are situations where it's like, this guy is literally going to kill you and all of your siblings, and has killed dozens and dozens and dozens of others. So maybe it is fine for him to die, but it is still going to kind of mess you up just to have committed the act of taking a human life, which is, I think, something I have felt especially keenly the older I get. Is I don't know if it's like a weird sort of like late forming empathy or just more awareness of my own mortality, but death has become so much more horrifying to me than it used to be, because I become so aware of what it means for a person to just be gone. Even if I don't know them, it's just like, Jesus, that's a tragedy every time. And so I don't want to ignore, I don't want to kind of like ignore what that does to her. So like, I think the feeling of triumph is very real. I know that I felt very triumphant writing that scene, and I know it is a scene that a lot of people really like. But I think there is definitely also still like a horror, like there's still an amount to which she doesn't want her siblings to necessarily have to carry the guilt of it. She doesn't want them to have to look at her and know, I purposefully, willfully killed him. I didn't necessarily have to, but I did have to, and I did it. She doesn't want them to know that about her, I think. Even if they know, she doesn't want it confirmed, because it is also still horrifying.
Yeah. I mean, that's something that I found really interesting about the way that the book ends, is that is something, I mean, it would be one kind of story to have an uncomplicated kind of ending where, you know, you have this sort of found family of these sisters who have been thrust together, and they come to an understanding of each other, and there is a violence to it, but it's necessary, and they all come together in the end and just end up being closer and find their power and things like that. There are aspects of all of that in how the book actually does end, but it's not that, right? Like there is this experience that she has, not just the fact that she was doing it as a form of both self-defense and defending her sisters, but also that she found it thrilling to do so, is something that does come between her and her sisters. It's something that sort of separates her from them. I think the closing paragraphs of the book are really, really sort of underlining that separation, right?
Yeah.
And even the fact that the family doesn't all stay together in the end, that some of them choose to leave, is also something that felt very true to me, even if it was not necessarily what I might have expected for certainly a young adult novel that was from when I was a kid, you know, probably would have ended up with more togetherness in the end, I think.
Yeah.
But I think that the way that it does end it rings a lot more true to how that situation would actually play out, if that makes sense. But can we, I mean, the fact that there are consequences to all of these things was really interesting, and how it all played out. I mean, it seems like that must have been something that was important to you. So like, can we talk about that a little bit?
Yeah. I mean, that was definitely something I thought about because that's just something that's interesting to me. I mean, part of it was because when I initially kind of tried to write a slightly more everything's good ending, but it didn't feel true is the thing. Like even as I was writing it, it didn't feel true. Like it didn't feel true that Derry would want everyone to just know, or that they would be okay with it if she did tell them that she killed him and enjoyed it. Mm-hmm. They wouldn't be okay with that. And I think probably one of the only people who would have understood probably would have been Winnie, and she doesn't have Winnie anymore. I think there's actually probably an extent to which Elle might have understood too, but Derry doesn't want to be seen that way. And I definitely did kind of think a lot about what everyone would do after. And I think it does come back again to that true feeling where there were just some characters where to me I thought, I don't think they'd want to stay here. Their siblings are extremely important to them. They'll always be family, but a lot of really bad things happened here. This is not a good place in a lot of ways, not least because obviously the forest has all of its own shit going on. Mm-hmm. But even just the things that happened in those last couple of days, and then that had happened before they were ever born. This is a place that was kind of built on bones. And to me, it felt like there were going to be some of them who felt like they wanted to escape that and wanted to go find this family that they had lost instead, and want to see if they could reconnect or just want to be away. Irene is someone I think of where a lot of why she left was because it was just too much. It was just too much to stay there with everything that lived there and everything that died there. But other people were going to have a reaction of not wanting their home to be taken from them by those memories. That's how I think Jane feels. And it is that a lot of bad things happened here, but she can make it a home again. She can take this place that has seen a lot of horror and she can make it good. And then Derry probably has more complicated feelings on that, but stays mostly because to her, it's her parents are dead for one thing. So she doesn't have a family to go find. And her sisters and siblings that she kind of made at the lake house are her family now, and she can't imagine being without them. Obviously she is so protective of them and she wants to keep them safe no matter what. So she was always going to stay. There was a little while where it kind of seemed like it might literally just be Jane and Derry. But I didn't think the little twins would leave either. For one thing, they're very young. So that would be a little weird to just let them go off on the road. And I'd actually love to at some point, if I can, write about what the lake house kind of becomes, because I know what happens there later. I am someone who is a sucker for any story that ends with someone opening a school for sad kids or weird kids or magic kids or orphans or anything like that. I love the end of Little Women because of that. And in this, I only had the room to talk about that potential, but that is what happens in my mind. That is what happens is they do kind of find other magic kids and bring them in. But yeah, I definitely just, when I wrote it, it was thinking about what felt true to the characters and true to the complexity of how people react to things, because that's something that's really important and interesting to me, especially in terms of death and grief. Is something that drives me bonkers is people who act like there are only a few valid ways to react to grief or hurt or pain. And that if you go outside of that, then you either must not really be grieving or there must be something wrong with you, because the actual human experience is that there are very few wrong reactions to grief and pain in general. Like, it can manifest in so many ways. And so to me, it made sense that for some people it would be, let's pretend this never happened. And for some people it would be, this happened and we are going to move forward. And for others it would be, this happened and I cannot deal with it and I must leave. That just felt more real and true to me.
Yeah. Well, why don't we take a break and then come back and do the second segment?
Heck yeah.
So for the second segment, I always invite the guests to bring a topic of their own, which could be whatever you'd like to talk about, whatever happens to be on your mind. So what would you like to talk about today?
Yeah, I am thinking about, especially now actually that we've talked about like fan fiction and teens and everything, I am still thinking about teen writers and just how much I love them. And I guess also more specifically about the Alpha Young Writers Workshop, which is a workshop that I volunteer for and was a student at so many years ago. That is a workshop specifically for kids who write science fiction, fantasy, and horror. It is a yearly workshop right now. We hope to kind of be able to do more events throughout the year later when we have money. But currently it is every year. We take 20 students between 14 and 19 years old who submitted a story for the application, and then all the application stories are judged, and the top 20 become the students for that year of Alpha. And they come to, the past couple of years it's been digital for obvious reasons.
Yes.
We are attempting an in-person Alpha this year with a lot of like vaccine requirements and testing and just a lot of regulations in place. But they go to a university campus in Pennsylvania and spend a couple weeks hanging out with other teen writers and hearing from guest authors who come for a few days to do lessons. And over the course of that, they also write a short story and then workshop it with their peers, along with the staff that is there, because there's guest authors, but then there's also just staff who are adults that are either writers themselves or just people who work with kids. And so it's basically kind of like a mini baby Clarion workshop, much shorter and for children, but it is wonderful. It was an extremely formative experience for me. I am not sure that I would have persisted with writing if I had not gone to Alpha, or that I would have been as prepared to enter the professional side without Alpha, because one of the great things is that you learn a lot about the publishing industry there. That's always like the one of the favorite topics for the teens, for the students. They want to know, how does publishing work? How do you submit stories? How do you write query letters? How do you get an agent? They are rabid to know about that. And that's where I learned all of that, because I did not learn it in my creative writing program at school in college. And it's kind of just like a really, really wonderful experience. And I got to staff it. I'm not going to be on site staff this year, but I got to be on site staff digitally the last 2 years. And it was just one of the best experiences. Teen writers are amazing. They're just so incredible. Honestly, I want to be like them in so many ways, because they are so good at not self-rejecting their ideas. They just come up with weird, cool stuff that, like, as an adult, you kind of start to go, oh, is that too weird? Will people get that? Oh, whereas the younger of a writer you are, the less you self-reject that way. The more that you are just like, here's a bunch of cool shit happening. And I love to watch that happen. My favorite parts of it have been so far, like, I say always, but I've staffed 2 years, so I don't know if that's good enough for always, but I love brainstorming with them. I love hearing their ideas and asking them questions, and it's just so much fun, especially because with this particular, like, demographic of students that we tend to get, a lot of the answers tend to be make it gayer. Um, a lot of, it's very good. But yeah, no, this workshop is just very important to me. And it's a genuinely just like very, very cool workshop. We get some really amazing guest authors. Like the years I went, Holly Black was there. Tamara Pierce is there almost every year. She's kind of like the writer in residence a lot of the time. Like she has been with the workshop, I think, since the beginning, like 20 years ago. And she is definitely a huge pull for a lot of people. Just because if you say, Tamara Pierce is going to be here, a lot of kids get very excited. But we just got a lot of really, really, there's some that I didn't get to see because I was not a student or a staffer, but like, I know they've had like N.K. Jemisin there. Last year, Fonda Lee was there and she was incredible. Like, I mean, every author that we had last year and the year before were all incredible. My terrible human memory is mixing them all up and making their names just disappear from my head. And it's not because they were bad, because they were great. But it's just such an incredible experience where they get to learn from these really talented authors, and they get to form these like mentor relationships with really wonderful staffers, and also get to like make friendships that might last for a really long time. I have friendships still that exist because of people I met at Alpha 10, 11, 12 years ago. Like I think I went in probably 2008, 2009, those 2 years. And there are still people there I'm friends with. It's also just like an immediate, like anytime someone tells me, oh yeah, I went to Alpha, even if they weren't in my year, I'm like, cool, we're both Alphans. You are my friend now. We are here together. And that's why I work for, volunteer with Alpha now on their admin team, because the team is largely made of former Alphans, and they knew me and asked if I wanted to be with them. And it was like, yes, I do. So yeah.
Yeah. I think it's, it's really true. Even when you're not going as a kid to things like conferences and workshops, or I know for me, for example, like here in San Diego, there's a photography festival that happens every year. And at least half of the value of doing things like that. I mean, it's great to see what other people are doing. It's great to see lectures. It's great to have your own work reviewed and critiqued. But at least half of the value is just meeting other people who are doing similar things to what you're doing, and just sort of establishing that peer group and that community. I find that kind of thing just so sustaining.
Yeah.
I think, the thing that you were saying about how the younger writers, they don't self-reject, they don't self-edit as much when they're coming up with ideas. I wonder how much of that is because when you're younger, you're thinking less about doing something with the work than you are about just playing around with it. You know what I mean?
I think there's an element of that for sure. I think it's a little of that. I think it's a little of you have not yet necessarily learned to think that these things are like embarrassing or weird or cringy or whatever. Or if you have, you don't care yet. Or you are just extremely convinced that your ideas are great and that anyone who reads them will love them. Like that's just true. I know that that's something that I think went away as I got older. So like I think the older teens might struggle with that more, but especially the younger ones. Or I've also worked with elementary school age kids with creative writing when I was in college, and there is zero self-rejection there. Yeah. Absolutely none. It doesn't exist. They are just putting the weirdest stuff on paper, and it's great. I love it.
Yeah, there's no confidence like the confidence of a child.
Basically, like I think about the stuff that I wrote when I was a kid, and it's stuff that I would never write now because I would think this is too silly. This is like weird. This is not interesting, or this is cringy or whatever. But as a kid, I didn't see it that way. To me, it was the coolest stuff in the world. And I think objectively, well, not objectively, from my adult point of view where I increasingly am embracing those things again. I think they're cool ideas. Whether or not I would write them, I don't know, because some of them are cool ideas in that I love that my child self came up with that. That's very creative. Would it make an actual publishable story? Don't know. But I do think there's also that element of like, you're dreaming about the stuff being published, but not necessarily actually expecting it to be yet. It's not a real thing yet. Although then again, at Alpha, like one of the things we do is at the end of the year, the end of the workshop, we do a submission party where the students who want to actually submit stories to magazines, and we like celebrate them and get like really excited that they have sent in maybe sometimes their very first submission ever. A lot of the time a lot of them end up submitting stuff to Clark's World, mostly because the turnaround time is very, very fast. But they get to have that experience of submitting something and just having that support and having a community behind them who believes in them and believes in their ability to have their stories published. And some kids get accepted. It has happened before where kids will get their stories in some really cool places, either the story that they submitted at the workshop or very soon after. We get a lot of talented kids there though, and they usually just become more talented. But yeah, they kind of get that experience. And then we also talk a lot about the experience of like rejection and how to deal with that. We try to teach them like a lot of practical things while also trying extremely hard to nurture that wild creativity and that freedom. Like we want them to know about how publishing works, and they want to know because they just think it's so interesting, and it is. And we also, the last 2 years I staffed one of the most popular panels where we could have talked forever probably because they had so many questions, were the mental health and writing panels, where they wanted to know, especially, how do you do this when you have ADHD or depression or anxiety? They have these real questions about how do you do this? Is this possible? And I hope that it's helpful for them to hear from a lot of the staff, because it's usually with the on-site staff, not the guest authors, but to hear from us that we struggle with very similar things, and it is hard, but it's also possible.
Yeah.
You can still do it.
I think that it's, the whole idea and the whole experience of submitting stories for publication can be so intimidating, and it's such a hurdle to overcome. I never got to be a part of any kind of creative writing program or anything like that. So when I started submitting writing, just getting over that hump was a very difficult thing for me to do. And I think it seems like if I had been able to have someone kind of hold my hand through the process and celebrate the fact that I submitted something at all, right? That you're celebrating the submission, not necessarily the acceptance. That seems like it would be such a valuable experience. There's another thing that you said too that it really kind of stuck in my head when you were talking about sort of re-embracing the stuff that you were coming up with as a kid, because this is a little bit of a tangent, but there is this thing happening on TikTok right now, and it's like the best thing ever, which is these grown-up black men frolicking in fields.
Oh, I've seen those.
Yeah.
They're so nice. They're so joyful.
Yeah,
I love them.
It's so much joy and so much just about, being in the moment, embracing joy, embracing play, embracing pleasure, right? And these are things that we just don't do as adults, right? And especially for black men, I'm sure that there is an even bigger dimension there over and beyond what any adult has put on them. But just this idea of moving back towards things that are pleasurable, because when you're a child, you just do that. You just do things because they're joyful or because they feel good, and you don't learn to be embarrassed about that until you get a little older. It just seems like such a valuable thing to me, to be able to move back towards things that are simply pleasurable as an artist. And I feel like I more and more have been hearing writers and other kinds of artists talking about doing that. And what ends up coming out of it is something that other people find pleasurable also. You know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely. I do think that a lot of the time that joy transfers. I think it's a combination of that joy transfers and that just, I'm not sure there are any truly unique human experiences and feelings. So if there's something that like you love and find joy with, there's probably someone else who does too. Even if you're like, this is super weird and niche, there's probably someone else who also thinks it's very cool. But I do think that joy can be infectious and it can extremely come through. And I think that also is very related back to like that fangirl thing of just like not being ashamed of the things you like and just really proudly loving them loudly, which I think is so much harder to do as an adult because there is like that feeling of you're supposed to be like more stoic. You're supposed to be like responsible, which is something that I kind of in general try to reject. I don't really understand the people who think it's weird for adults to like enjoy cartoons or still enjoy kids movies or have stuffed animals or like stickers or whatever. I'm wearing a Sailor Moon hoodie right now. It's really pink and I love it. And I've gotten compliments on it every time I've worn it in public. There are people who are like, I love that. Adults, grown adults who love it. But I think there is definitely like a sense of shame around being an adult who loves things. Like I'm thinking of like the backlash against like Disney adults, which I don't fully know all the dimensions of that. So there may be things that Disney adults do that are genuinely bad in some way. Most of the examples I've seen have just been people who really, really love Disney and love going to Disneyland or Disney World. And it's hard to get me to think that's bad or shameful in some way. It's just like, sounds like they figured out what they love. I think that's nice. I've been to Disneyland like once as an adult, and it was amazing. It was actually somehow still extremely magical, despite the fact that I was like 24 or 25 the very first time I ever went. And one of my favorite things was seeing the like packs of adults who would have like biker gang vests full of Disney pins walking around. It was like, they love this.
Yeah.
And actually back to like just like how kids have like no shame about this. One of my favorite life experiences was at Disneyland. I was in the bathroom at the Little Mermaid restaurant, and this little girl I was wearing like a lanyard with a bunch of Disney pins on it that my sister and her wife had gotten for me. And one of them was a really big button that said like first time or something. It was basically just declaring this was my first trip to Disneyland. And she saw it and she was like, oh, is this your first time at Disneyland? And she couldn't be older than like 7. And I said, yeah. And she was like, oh, I come all the time. It's really great. Are you having fun? And I said, I was like, yeah, I'm having a lot of fun. And she was like, that's good. It's my birthday. and she just sounded so like adult about it. Like she was just very like, yeah, I come to Disneyland all the time. And she was very interested in knowing if I was having fun. And she was happy that I was having fun. And I just thought that was the sweetest thing in the whole world. That I was like this grown adult and she was just so pleased. This tiny child was so pleased that I was having fun at my first time at Disneyland. And I think that's the kind of thing you might not always see with an adult. Like other adults might not get that I'm having a magical experience at Disneyland in my 20s.
Yeah.
But kids get it. Kids just like things and they want to experience the things they like. That's why kids are also good at like watching the same movies over and over, much to the like possible detriment of their parents' sanity. I'm a rewatcher still as an adult. I think it's like some of it's like a neurodivergent thing. I love to rewatch the same things, listen to the same songs over and over and over again. But I know I drove my parents like up the wall because I don't even know how many times I watched the Rainbow Bright Birthday Party VHS.
Yeah.
But it was a lot, and I think my mom was happy when it broke.
Yeah, that's the thing about, when we were younger, you could actually wear out a tape where nowadays it's all streaming. So,
oh no, I had not thought about that until this moment. But that's true. Like, yeah, when the Rainbow Bright tape broke, we couldn't necessarily even replace that. But, oh no, you can't break Baby Shark. Although I read a lot of parenting advice columns, and advice columns in general, just because I think they're kind of fun. And I have read many letters recently where the advice was basically just tell them that the iPad doesn't work anymore. It doesn't work past 5:00. You just can't do it. That's just how iPads work. And they're 4, so they believe you.
Yeah, they grow out of that real quick.
Yeah, that is the thing. That is also the thing, is that kids are really smart, and kids now are so much smarter about technology.
Yeah.
Because they just grow up with it. I have a niece and nephew who, I think probably understand iPads and stuff better than I do. And they're 6 and 9.
Yeah. Yeah, it is a humbling experience for sure. So there's one last question that I always like to end with, and that is, if there is a piece of art or literature or creativity in some form that you've experienced recently that meant something to you.
Yes, this was actually something where I saw the question and I went through my planner, because I was like, I do not remember anything I've consumed at all. But I write down every piece of media that I consume in my planner. On every day page, I write down what movies I watched and TV shows I watched and stuff I listened to. And I have a couple. One of them is a book that is not out yet, which I know some people think this is the most annoying thing authors do, but I'm sorry. We get to read books early and they're good. But The Renaissance of Gwen Hathaway by Ashley Schumacher. I've never said her name out loud, and I'm suddenly worried I got it wrong, but I think that's correct. That book is, I think, not coming out until next year, but it was beautiful. It was so good. It's a YA contemporary romance set at a Renaissance fair with a fat protagonist who grew up going to Renaissance fairs. And it's so good. It's just it's got a lot of feelings about grief and family and friendship, and it's just so good. It made me feel a lot of things. And then the other one I thought of was kind of a different sort of meaning something to me, because initially I was trying to think of things that emotionally impacted me, like The Renaissance of Gwen Hathaway did. But I think also something can mean something to you just because it made you happy. And this is, I guess, slightly longer ago, because it's last month that I think I caught up. I finally started listening to a different actual play D&D podcast. I'm very bad about getting into these because I'm really picky. The vibe needs to be just right for me to get into it. So for a long time, I was basically just listening to the first season of Adventure Zone and Dungeons and Daddies, and that was it. But
two of my faves also.
It's incredible. It's perfect. I'm obsessed. But last month I binged Rude Tales of Magic. And that was so fun. It just made me very, very happy. I had meant to listen to it forever because Ian got into it way before I did. He does that with everything. He's also the one who got me into Adventure Zone after I got him into the McElroys in general. He's the one who got me into Dungeons and Daddies, and he's the one who got me into Rude Tales. So I really just need to start trusting him because we clearly have the exact same taste on these. But there's a character in it who is exactly like our terrible kitten, Rudy. And
which character? Because now that'll help me understand your cat.
Stir Fry.
Oh, okay.
And we call him Stir Fry, and we say Carlos is like Mr. DeBonesby. So whenever Rudy's following Carlos around, we'll just be like, Mr. DeBonesby. Because Rudy is so chaotic.
Yeah.
But I just it made me so happy. There were just so many parts that made me laugh until I cried. And it was also just great because Ian had already listened to all of it up to that point, and I always love when we get something that we can share. Basically, when we can have that thing of like, have you listened to the new Dungeons and Daddies yet? Because he'll usually listen to podcasts at work or on the drive to work because he has like an hour commute, and I'll be at home listening to it also. And I just love when we can start talking about things and theorizing about things or complaining. I am trying so hard not to just immediately start talking about all of my various thoughts about what is happening in Rude Tales of Magic and Dungeons and Daddies. Because I love, like, that's one of my, like, things that I truly, truly love. It just makes me so happy is when we are, like, sitting around trying to either watch something or listen to something, and something reminds us of something from a podcast or a show we're watching, and we pause it and spend an hour just talking about the show we're literally trying to watch or listen to at that moment. That happened a lot when we were watching Outer Range recently, which is a show that did not mean much to me.
Okay.
It was fine.
Okay. Well, noted. I'll put that in the show notes.
I will call it solidly pretty fine, I guess.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you so much for talking with me. I really enjoyed our conversation.
I did also.
Okay, as I mentioned at the top of the show, there are links in the show notes where you can purchase copies of A Dark and Starless Forest. There is also a link to Sarah's website as well as her Twitter account. And let me just tell you, Sarah is utterly delightful on Twitter. And that is our show. Editing and mixing on this episode is by me, the music is by Poddington Bear, and transcription help is by Shea Aguinaldo. If you've been enjoying Keep the Channel Open and you'd like to hear more, help spread the word. Tell the podcast, book, and art lovers in your life to subscribe wherever they get their podcasts. You can find all of the show's social media information, email newsletter, transcripts, and show notes on our website at keepthechanneleopen.com. Keep the Channel Open will be taking a short break, and we'll return on June 22nd, so do be sure to come back for that. And until then, remember, keep the channel open.